The deafening shriek of iron grinding against iron swallowed the young brakeman's final scream as two massive freight cars slammed together, crushing his chest in an instant. It was a freezing midnight in a New York rail yard in the late 1800s, and the snow beneath the wheels quickly turned a dark, heavy red. There was no time to mourn, no time to stop the engines, and no doctor waiting in the wings to save a man who was just doing his job. The yard boss simply signaled for the next train to move, leaving another broken body in the freezing mud while the cargo kept rolling toward the city. Men with lanterns rushed forward, not to offer comfort, but to drag their fallen co-worker off the tracks so the line could clear. The heavy steam engines hissed and roared, drowning out the frantic shouts of the crew as they laid the lifeless worker beside a pile of frozen coal. This was not a rare tragedy, but a daily expected cost of doing business in the booming era of steam and steel. For the men who kept the trains moving, survival was a matter of luck, and sudden, violent death was always just one slipped footstep away. That young brakeman's life ended in the snow, but the brutal machine that demanded his sacrifice was just beginning its conquest of the American landscape. The tracks required blood to expand, and the men who owned those tracks were perfectly willing to let their workers pay that terrible price. At the top of this unforgiving machine sat the Vanderbilt family, a dynasty that was rapidly claiming ownership of the nation's future. Through aggressive tactics and ruthless ambition, they built the New York Central Railroad into an unstoppable empire of iron and wood. Their rail lines spread out across the country like dark, heavy veins, eating up millions of acres of land, cutting through mountains, and swallowing vast amounts of coal and timber. The Vanderbilts did not just build a transportation system, they built an absolute monopoly that controlled how food, fuel, and people moved across the United States. Every new mile of track brought unimaginable profits flowing directly back into the Vanderbilt bank accounts. The New York Central became a money-making engine unlike anything the world had ever seen, crushing smaller competitors and rewriting the rules of American commerce. Entire towns lived or died based on where the family decided to lay their steel rails, giving a single family the power to dictate the survival of thousands of communities. They were untouchable giants of industry, operating far above the dirt, the noise, and the danger of the rail yards that made them rich. The distance between the owners and the workers was not just measured in miles, but in completely different realities of human existence. While families of the dead track workers begged for scraps of coal to survive the brutal winters, the Vanderbilt family threw lavish, glittering parties inside giant marble mansions in New York City. They dined on silver plates, draped themselves in diamonds, and spent millions of dollars on summer palaces that rivaled European royalty. The sheer blinding scale of their wealth was built directly on top of the silent suffering of the men who bled out in the rail yards. A single chandelier hanging in a Vanderbilt ballroom cost more than a railroad worker could earn in 50 lifetimes of back-breaking labor. The women of the dynasty wore silk gowns that brushed across imported rugs, completely insulated from the widows who washed blood out of heavy canvas work clothes in freezing tenement apartments. It was a dark, unsettling divide where human life at the bottom was treated as cheap and disposable, so that the lives at the top could be endlessly draped in gold. Behind those heavy mansion doors, the cries of the injured were easily ignored, replaced by the clinking of champagne glasses and the steady hum of expanding profits. But out on the tracks, the terrifying reality of the work could never be shut out. The daily hazards faced by the New York Central crews were nothing short of a mechanical nightmare. Before the invention of automatic air brakes, the job of stopping a heavy freight train fell to men who had to physically run across the tops of moving rail cars. In the dead of winter, these curved wooden roofs were coated in slick, hard ice, and the trains violently jerked and swayed as they rushed through the freezing wind. A single slip meant falling between the crushing wheels of the massive cars, a fate that claimed thousands of men who were simply trying to slow the train down. Down on the ground, the danger was just as severe for the men assigned to link the massive iron cars together. They had to stand directly between two rolling freight cars, holding a heavy iron pin, waiting for the exact split second the metal hit to drop the pin in place. If the engineer backed up too fast, or if the workers' frozen fingers slipped, their hands, arms, or entire bodies would be permanently crushed in the heavy iron jaws of the coupling mechanism. Missing fingers became the grim, unofficial badge of a veteran rail worker, a permanent physical reminder of a job that demanded pieces of their bodies in exchange for a meager paycheck. The crushed limbs and shattered spines left on those icy tracks were treated not as human tragedies but as routine mechanical failures to be cleared away. Every drop of blood spilled in the rail yard simply became another minor inconvenience for the empire to manage, a problem requiring swift paperwork rather than an ounce of pity. Deep within the towering stacks of Vanderbilt archives, the most unsettling mysteries are found not in what was written but in what was left entirely blank. When a catastrophic derailment or a yard accident tore a man apart, the company ledgers meticulously tracked every single penny required to fix the damage. You can open these heavy, dust-covered books today and see the exact cost recorded for a replacement iron wheel, a splintered wooden tie, or a bent coupling pin. But when you scan those same yellowed pages for the man who lost his leg or his life under that very wheel, there is only a chilling, absolute silence. The ledgers assigned absolutely zero financial value to the human being whose blood stained the cargo. How could an empire built by human hands look at a father's violent death and calculate only the price of the metal that crushed him? To protect their bottomless wealth from the grieving widows asking for help, the Vanderbilt lawyers constructed a fortress of dark, complicated legal traps. They did not just ignore the pleas for compensation, they weaponized the law to ensure the railroad never had to pay a single dime. The company invented simple, cruel rules designed specifically to trap uneducated families in a maze of legal jargon they could never hope to escape. The most devastating weapon in their legal arsenal was a twisted tactic that shifted the blame entirely onto the victims themselves. If a rusted brake failed and sent a man plunging to his death, the company lawyers would simply claim that another worker on the train was responsible for the mistake. By pointing the finger at a fellow employee, the railroad legally washed its hands of the tragedy, leaving the grieving family with no one to hold accountable and no way to survive. These calculated legal maneuvers ensured that the courtroom doors were locked tight against anyone seeking justice for a fallen rail worker. With the law expertly stacked against them, the true horror of the railroad's negligence fell squarely onto the shoulders of those least equipped to bear it. The knock at the door would come late at night, delivering a terrifying reality that destroyed a family's world in an instant. A young mother would stand in the doorway, learning her husband was dead, and in that exact agonizing moment, she knew her children might actually starve. There were no safety nets, no government programs, and no emergency funds waiting to catch them as they fell into total ruin. Left with nothing but a shattered heart and empty pockets, these widows faced a heartbreaking nightmare just to keep a roof over their heads. They were forced to pull their young sons out of school and send them right back to the very same deadly rail yards that had just killed their fathers. The grief was suffocating, but the immediate, crushing terror of absolute poverty left them with no time to mourn, only a desperate scramble to survive the winter. While families were drowning in this sudden panic, the railroad was already deploying a shadow network of aggressive corporate operatives. These men were known as claims agents, but in reality they were highly paid fixers whose only job was to sprint to the scene of a bloody accident before the dust even settled. Their mission was never to offer comfort or genuine assistance, but to protect the Vanderbilt fortune by silencing the victims before they could even understand what had happened. These fixers employed deeply unethical tactics, literally sneaking into dimly lit hospital wards while a severely injured worker was still drifting in and out of consciousness. Standing over a hospital bed, they would pressure a man high on painkillers to sign away his legal rights for a pitiful handful of cash. If the worker had already died, the agent would rush to the widow's home, using intimidation and confusing paperwork to trick her into signing away her family's future for a fraction of what they deserved. The ruthless pressure from these company fixers left mourning families with a terrible choice: accept a few dollars immediately, or face complete financial ruin fighting a giant. By signing those hastily drafted waivers in dimly lit hospital rooms, widows unknowingly surrendered their only chance to hold the railroad accountable for the blood spilled on its tracks. Archival ledgers from the New York Central Railroad reveal a chilling reality. Denying these claims was never just a series of random, cruel decisions made by low-level managers. It was a highly organized, deeply embedded business strategy designed to protect the Vanderbilt fortune at all costs. Every denied claim, Every silenced widow and every ignored safety hazard was factored into a massive, calculated formula where human lives were simply written off as the cost of doing business. The company built an entire bureaucratic machine dedicated to shifting the blame away from their own dangerous operations. Executives created strict internal policies demanding that every accident be categorized as worker carelessness, regardless of the actual evidence left at the grisly scene. This systemic denial ensured that the immense profits flowing into the Vanderbilt estate remained completely untouched by the staggering human toll required to keep the trains running. This machinery of denial was so efficient that claim rejections became an automated process, stamped and filed before the victims were even buried. Clerks were trained to immediately dispatch form letters citing obscure rule violations, effectively closing investigations before local authorities could even begin asking questions. This dark history directly shatters our modern understanding of fairness, revealing how extreme, unchecked wealth can completely twist the very concept of justice. When a grieving family did find the courage to take the railroad to court, they were not stepping into a balanced arena of law. They were walking into a slaughterhouse, facing the most expensive, ruthless legal minds the Vanderbilt fortune could buy. The Dynasty weaponized its massive capital to exhaust, delay, and completely crush penniless widows who could barely afford a single lawyer, let alone years of appeals. Judges, often influenced by the sheer economic power and political reach of the railroad, routinely dismissed these desperate cases on technicalities, ensuring that the scales of justice were heavily weighed down by Vanderbilt gold. The crushing realization that the law protected the billionaires while abandoning the broken workers left a deep generational scar on these industrial communities. Families were forced to watch in silent agony as the very men responsible for their ruin continued to build massive mansions, their wealth insulated by a legal system they effectively owned. But the sheer, staggering volume of broken bodies and shattered families eventually became a nightmare that society could no longer ignore. Out of this profound darkness and systemic abuse, a slow, incredibly painful resistance began to form among the surviving rail workers. Banding together in secret meetings and early labor unions, these men started to push back against the iron grip of the railroad barons, laying the bloody groundwork for the very first hard-fought corporate liability laws in the nation. The blood spilled on the tracks of the New York Central Railroad did not simply wash away with the rain. It slowly stained the legal foundation of the entire country, forcing a reckoning that the tycoons had spent millions trying to prevent. The relentless wave of shattered families and unpaid widows eventually became too massive for the courts to ignore, breaking the absolute immunity the railways had bought and paid for. Out of this calculated cruelty, the modern concept of corporate liability was born. Laws were finally drafted that stripped away the old defenses, making it impossible for a company to simply blame a dead brakeman for his own gruesome end. The legal shields forged by the Vanderbilt dynasty cracked, establishing a permanent precedent that a corporation must pay for the lives it consumes in the pursuit of profit. The true cost of the Vanderbilt empire was not measured in steel or coal, but in the quiet devastation of the neighborhoods bordering the tracks. When a railroad worker was crushed between rail cars and the company lawyers successfully blamed the victim, the punishment did not end with the funeral. Without compensation, a widow had no way to pay the rent or buy food for her children. Entire families were instantly pushed into deep poverty, forcing young sons to leave school and take up the same dangerous railroad jobs that had just killed their fathers. This cycle of denied claims created a permanent underclass of grieving families who were legally erased by the very system that relied on their labor. The railway's aggressive legal strategy did more than save the company money on a single afternoon. It built a rigid wall between corporate wealth and human suffering, establishing a brutal standard that said an injured worker was simply a broken tool, easily replaced and entirely responsible for their own misfortune. The blueprints drafted in the shadow of the New York Central Railroad did not vanish when the steam engines finally rusted away. Instead, those late 19th century ledgers and courtroom victories laid the absolute foundation for every corporate denial playbook used today. When a modern insurance adjuster stamps a medical claim as unnecessary, or a corporate lawyer buries a grieving family in endless paperwork, they are executing a brutal strategy perfected by the Vanderbilt dynasty. The true aftershock of this era was not just the massive physical toll left on the tracks, but the chilling, permanent realization that human life had been successfully classified as a highly manageable, easily dismissible business expense. Deep beneath the towering, gilded arches of Grand Central Terminal, the ground still holds the heavy silence of the forgotten. Every polished marble floor and every massive fortune passed down through the generations was paid for in blood that was never acknowledged and claims that were never settled. The trains just keep moving forward, rushing over the invisible graves of the men and women who built the empire, leaving nothing behind but the cold, enduring echo of denied justice.